Ziegler from framingpaterno.com. John, welcome back to KDK. Good to have you on.
Always great to talk to you, man, Gino.
What did you think when you saw this story coming out of Penn State that the new president is saying they should be rewarded for what they're doing up there?
Well, I thought it was in keeping with this entire story, which, as you know, I've been covering from the beginning, have basically dedicated my life, for better or for worse, over the last 2+ years to investigating what really happened. And if there's one thing, just one thing I could tell people to explain this story is that everything is the opposite as it appears. And that is that everybody who has gotten praise in this story actually deserves criticism, and those who have been most criticized actually deserve praise. And I found it to be hilarious that Penn State is claiming that they should be rewarded for their post-Sandusky actions because, frankly, I think the only thing they ought to be punished for is what they did post-November of 2011 and the Sandusky revelations coming forward and his arrest and the firing of Joe Paterno on November 9th of 2011. I think prior to that, it's very difficult to figure out what Penn State did wrong. After that, it's almost impossible to figure out what Penn State did right.
Let me ask you this. He's saying that when it comes to compliance and sports ethics, just that narrow scope, is that worthy of praise out of Penn State?
Well, it always was. I mean, and again, people who don't know me, I have no connection to Penn State. I'm actually speaking to you from Los Angeles right now.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, but I didn't go there. I went to Georgetown. There was nothing wrong with Penn State's culture to begin with. And frankly, the only thing that ever changed their culture was this unbelievable self-flagellation, wussification, throw everybody under the bus, destroy people's due process rights, destroy a football program, an amazing legacy, throw your own students under the bus by kowtowing to the NCAA in a way that was unprecedented, unnecessary. That's the most ridiculous part of the whole NCAA thing. It was totally unnecessary. The NCAA had no leverage, at least not the leverage that Penn State pretended that they did. If there was a death penalty on the table, they should have said, please give us the death penalty. It would have been the greatest thing that ever happened to Penn State because the judge would have issued an immediate injunction. Nothing would have happened. It would have bought time for the truth to come out, and they probably never would have been punished at all. I mean, the reality here, Mangino, is that Penn State is performed in the worst possible way in every single aspect of this scandal post-revelation. Pre-revelation, I've yet to figure out what major error they made. And that's what I mean when I say everything is upside down in this case. Everything that should be praised has been criticized and vice versa.
John Ziegler with us. The website is framingpaterno.com, framingpaterno.com, and we're talking about Penn State. One of the motives, I guess, out of Penn State was if we just go ahead and agree to the free report, to everything that it says, and we just take whatever the NCAA gives us, then we'll look good, and then all of a sudden we'll go from having this horrible view in the public eye to having a more positive view in the public eye, and then who knows, maybe at some point later on they'll be more merciful to us, but it's a whole lot better than what we would be what they would be facing from a PR standpoint if they decided to fight everything all the way through.
Well, as you know, I've made a large part of my career making documentary films about the news media. And I've never seen a story where the news media dictated every turn more than this one from the very moment the story broke nationally. And people have to understand, when you say Penn State, you're 100% right in what you just said there, Mangino. But people need to understand that when you're saying Penn State, to me what you're saying there is the Penn State Board of Trustees, who has a very different incentive than, for instance, the alumni of Penn State or any other element of what you would call Penn State, because they fired Joe Paterno and Graham Spanier for all intents and purposes. Mm-hmm. They did so with no evidence, no rationale. They admitted as such. They did so in the worst possible away. So what did they need? They needed an explanation. They needed cover. Louis Freeh was more than happy to provide that. In fact, he gave them more than I think they ever expected. The media got their pom-poms out. And then, of course, the members of the Board of Trustees, this is the thing that people don't understand. They were thrilled with what Louis Freeh did and what NCAA did. It got them off the hook. And frankly, as you know, in liberal academia, it's like government work. It's not their money. This is not a company with shareholders and a stock price. They don't care.
Well, the argument. Well, let me ask you this, because the argument would be that they made the best decision in their fiduciary responsibility and what to do with the assets and the brand Penn State, that if they would have decided to fight this all the way through, that it may have cost them even more. It may have put them in a bad light where you have enrollment that just plummets, and then the ultimate cost could have been greater by not accepting what came down with the Freeh report.
You know, that's a somewhat rational argument, except for the fact that the very same people that made that decision were the ones that dug the hole to begin with. I mean, if they don't fire Joe Paterno, a Grand Spaniard, right off the bat, if they don't hold a candlelight vigil ending any chance for Jerry Sandusky to get a fair trial, if they don't hire Louis Freeh to make up for past mistakes, if they don't cave to the NCAA and take down the statue of Joe Paterno to basically pave the way for the NCAA sanctions, if they don't agree to the settlements of the Sandusky accusers in a fashion that was absurd and I can prove was corrupt, if they don't do any of that, then none of what you're just saying is necessary, because they bought in, Penn State did, they bought into a narrative that is mythology.
But
mythology. It's
John,
as absurd as the USC hoax that you guys just played on the news. It didn't happen.
But I hear what you...
no scandal.
John, I hear what you're saying, and I agree, and I believe that Joe Paterno's hands are clean on this one, that he wasn't involved in this in any way, shape, or form. However, going back to something that you said at the beginning, that the media drove the direction of this story. It used to be said, you don't argue with people who buy ink in 55-gallon drums. Well, you don't argue with people who have control of the airwaves, and the number one sports network and all the media outlets that were going against Penn State can truth, and you've been dealing with this now for how many years, can truth push back against the media narrative that is now so fully invested in what they've been declaring for years now that they won't bring themselves to backpedal on anything?
I agree. Your assessment is 100% right. But see, this is where I guess I'm a little bit off, because I still believe that the truth ought to matter, at least somewhat. I'm a realist more than anybody. But see, part of the reason why the truth can't win here, Mangino,
yes,
is because everybody who hasn't studied this case, which is 99.9% of the population, thinks that Penn State basically declared themselves guilty. So someone like me, I can't get past first base with most people because they don't think there's a real story to be told, because they think, well, Penn State declared themselves guilty.
Right.
So why am I listening to John Ziegler? Well, they don't understand why Penn State declared themselves guilty. It was so that these business types and these liberal academics could go to cocktail parties and be proud that the New York Times was off their ass. That's what this was about. This was not about the truth. And frankly, I think there were a lot of people there that were happy that football finally got its comeuppance, because football was a beacon for that university. Joe Paterno was a hero, and there were a lot of jealous people, and they finally got their chance to bring down a legend.
Speaking of Joe Paterno, as you bring up Joe Paterno, there were a lot of people, even though Joe Paterno had major supporters inside the university, he also had his enemies at the university as well. Was that true?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, anybody who's been there that long, he was there 61 years. I mean, if you piss off 1% of the population every year, you're pissed off 61%. I mean, that's just the nature of the business, first of all. But second of all, there was a board member by the name of John Surma, the guy who ends up announcing his firing, there has been an incredible background story about why the Surma family had it out for Joe Paterno. It was Surma who canceled Joe Paterno's press conference, which I believe started this entire snowball down the hill, leading into the avalanche on that Tuesday morning after the arrest of Jerry Sandusky. If that had not happened, I think that was one of the key moments where everything could have been different. And if the Paterno forces have handled that much better, I still think everything would have been much different. The reality here was that at that time, Joe Paterno was being praised by the prosecution. The prosecution has said he was not part of a cover-up. I don't believe there was any cover-up at all, because I don't think there was much of anything to cover up. At least I can't find anything.
Do me a favor.
The reality here.
Go ahead. Go finish your thought.
No, I just wish people would look at the reality of this and the incentives that all of the participating forces had, because they're the opposite of what people think they are.
John Ziegler is with us, framingpaterno.com. I want you to address a couple of things when we come back. One, Joe Paterno's statement of wishing he could have done more. This is a perfect example of where you should hold your tongue and not speak, because whatever you say can and will be used against you in the court of public opinion. And he would have been better off not saying a word ever on this. And that one little phrase spun ultimately brought him down. And when you look at what's going on with Penn State now, is there any reason for anybody to genuinely believe that the sanctions that have been brought down by the NCAA are going to be lifted in any way, shape, or form? John Ziegler with us from framingpaterno.com. More with him in a moment. Me, John Ziegler, the website framingpaterno.com. We're talking about a story out of Penn State where the new president says that Penn State ought to be rewarded for what they've done post-Sandusky with the changes that they've made at the university. And we've been talking about what's happened and what, going back to the beginnings once again, as we oftentimes do. And John, it seems to me, and I'm not trying to blame all of this on Joe Paterno, but in Joe Paterno's statement that I think any compassionate individual would be making, that you wish if you could, you'd do more, that comment that he made really seemed to be the thing that everyone latched on and that then brought about his demise.
Well, this is a fascinating element of an incredible case. First of all, it's very important to point out what the statement, and it was a written statement. This was not something Joe Paterno said at a press conference, because, as I mentioned in the last segment, his press conference was canceled by a member of the Board of Trustees who would fire him about 32 hours later, named John Surma. What was said in the statement was, with the benefit of hindsight, I wish I had done more. Now, this is interesting on a number of levels. First of all, Joe Paterno had basically been a media darling for most of his career, and then in most situations, the media would have latched onto that and said, oh my gosh, that's so awesome that Joe Paterno has stood up and be the first person to take any responsibility for this situation, which to this day, Mangino, he's the only person who has said anything like that. Mm-hmm. And he got literally crucified for it, because the media took it totally out of context. They dropped off the in hindsight part, and they thought he was actually pleading guilty, which he was not. I have a theory, Mangino, although I can't prove this, but I have a lot of circumstantial evidence to back it up. There's a reason why Scott Paterno, who was running the response, for lack of a better term, during that week for the family, who was Joe's lawyer, did not make Joe or allow Joe to do his own interview after that press conference was canceled, because I'm convinced Scott was concerned that Joe would go off on a rant defending Jerry Sandusky, because he wasn't convinced Sandusky was guilty, or at the very least defending his right to due process and a fair trial. And Scott thought that that would be lethal from a PR standpoint. Now, he might have been right in the short run, but he was wrong in the long term because now Sandusky and Paterno are forever tied together, and they are checkmated from ever exonerating Joe Paterno because of this perception that they allowed to be created by the misperceptions of that statement. So I think that that's why Joe Paterno was making written statements. I'm not convinced Joe. I think Joe, before he died, that's why he said, I want the truth here. He didn't know the truth had been found yet, because I'm not convinced he was convinced of Jerry's guilt, or at the very least believed Jerry deserved a fair trial.
Do you think, in the benefit of hindsight, that saying anything was a mistake, that just silence would have been best?
Well, obviously it didn't work out, so clearly it was a mistake, but it was one of many mistakes. If I had been in charge, the moment that press conference got canceled, I invite ESPN into the Paterno kitchen with Tom Rinaldi was begging for the interview. I sit him down with Joe Paterno, and I tell him the story. Joe charms his socks off. It buys time. They get through the Nebraska game, and none of this happens, in my view.
Interesting. Now that the Penn State has been doing what they've been doing, and you argue that when it comes to the university itself and how they've run their ethics and all, that they've been an example throughout the NCAA. Do you have any reason to believe that the NCAA will lighten any of the sanctions that are imposed upon the university?
Well, as you well know, the Paterno family has and others have a lawsuit against the NCAA. I think the NCAA is very frightened of discovery in that case, and I have said for quite a long time, this is another fascinating element here. I think that entire case will come down to two words. We're sorry. Will the NCAA say they're sorry or not? I can't imagine the Paterno family accepting without an apology, and it's hard for me to understand how the NCAA gives in on accepting responsibility for having made a mistake. I think that eventually the Paterno wins will be restored. I think that's a no-brainer, and I think Penn State's sanctions that are left will probably be mitigated in some way, shape, or form, as they already have been to a certain degree. But it's going to be very interesting to see who budges on that phrase, "we're sorry," because that's what has to happen. There needs to be accountability for the NCAA having rushed to judgment in an abomination. Absolute abomination. Even if Jerry Sandusky is as guilty as sin, which I don't believe he is, what the NCAA did was nonsensical, absurd, against their own bylaws, had no logic behind it, and was unprecedented in every possible way. And it was unfair to those who were playing at Penn State and are still playing at Penn State today. It's just absolutely wrong. But the Paternos will win that lawsuit if they go all the way through with it. I just don't know, what it's going to take for them to say uncle on either side.
There's a part of me that would suggest that, well, the NCAA was dealing with the university that said, here's all the evidence against us. We agree to all the evidence that's against us, and please do with us as you will. And then on the flip side and that's pretty much what they said. And then on the flip side of that, you would think that if somebody walks into the DA and says, I just murdered somebody, that they would then do some type of an investigation to actually make sure you really did, and not just take your word for it,
you would think.
Yeah, you would think. John Ziegler, I wish I had more time, but the clock's telling me that I don't. Okay. The website is framingpaterno.com. Always a pleasure talking to you. John Ziegler, framingpaterno.com. Check it out for yourself. All right, stick around. Coming up after news, the Jim Bohannon Show. Great show tonight from